When you're trying to win hearts and minds, a really shocking statistic can be a powerful tool. But what happens when those numbers just don't quite add up? Today, we're diving into the preface of Christina Hoff Sommers' pretty controversial book, Who Stole Feminism? We're going to follow her investigation as she pulls on the thread of a single, startling claim, and we'll see how it unravels into a much broader critique of a movement she says she's a part of. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the explosive statistic that really kicked this whole thing off for the author. Then, we'll basically become detectives, following the paper trail to see where it leads. After that, we'll look at a few other case studies she brings up to make her case for what she sees as a pattern of misinformation. From there, we'll dig into her main theory and what she claims are the real-world consequences. And finally, we'll unpack her final argument and her reason for writing the book in the first place. All right, so every investigation has a starting point. For Christina Hoff Sommers, it all began with one single devastating number that seemed to point to this huge, hidden epidemic of suffering. Now just let that sink in. The claim is 150,000 deaths from anorexia every single year. To put that into perspective, the author notes this is more than 3 times the number of people who die in car accidents annually. It's a number that's pretty much impossible to just ignore. A number that big just begs the question, is it actually true? And that one question is what launched the author on a quest to trace the statistic all the way back to its source, a journey that would take her through the works of some of feminism's most famous voices. Okay, so this is where the detective work really begins. The author decided to follow the citations, to go from book to book, trying to find the original source for this absolutely shocking figure. And the citation trail was, well, it was a winding path. Gloria Steinem's book pointed to Naomi Wolf's bestseller, The Beauty Myth. Wolf, in turn, cited a historian named Joan Brumberg, and Brumberg's source, the American Anorexia and Bulimia Association. So, with the end of the line finally in sight, the author just picked up the phone. And here's the twist. The president of the association said they'd been misquoted. The number, 150,000, referred to the number of people suffering from the condition, not the number of people dying from it. I mean, that's a pretty crucial distinction that changes the entire story. So, what's the real number? Well, the book cites data from the National Center for Health Statistics, which reported figures closer to about 100 deaths in 1983 and then 54 in 1991. Now, as the author points out, every single one of those deaths is a tragedy, but those numbers are a very, very long way from 150,000. So you might be thinking, okay, was this just a one-time error, a simple mistake? Well, the author argues that it wasn't. She presents this as part of a much bigger pattern of what she calls advocacy research, basically alarming claims that spread like wildfire without any solid evidence behind them. The book actually dives into several of these viral claims. We've already looked at the anorexia statistic. She also investigates a supposed March of Dimes study on birth defects, and that widely circulated story about a huge spike in domestic violence on Super Bowl Sunday. Let's just take a quick look at the March of Dimes case. The claim, which was echoed by the president of the National Organization for Women, was that battery is the #1 cause of birth defects. But when the author actually reached out to the March of Dimes, they said they had no idea what she was talking about. They had no such report. And yet the story just took off. It was picked up by major news outlets. The author's investigation traced it all back to a simple misunderstanding at a conference. By the time anyone issued a retraction, the damage was already done. The story was out there. So this all leads to a really critical question, right? Why were these claims, which the author argues are totally unsubstantiated, so easily believed and shared? Well, this brings us to the central thesis of the book's preface. To try and explain this, the author introduces her own term, gender feminism. She describes it as an ideology that sees our society as a rigid patriarchy, basically a gender war where men have all the power and systematically oppress women. And this quote really gets to the heart of her theory about the motive. She argues that these gender feminists are driven to find and promote these stories of atrocity, to try and awaken women to their supposed oppression, and to persuade a skeptical public that there's a huge crisis happening. But the author doesn't just stop at identifying the problem. She argues that this whole approach has some really serious negative consequences, not just for the feminist movement, but for the very women it's supposed to be helping. She basically outlines 4 key areas of damage. First, she says these falsehoods distract from the real problems and end up harming actual victims. Second, they create this worldview of division and resentment. Third, they push away mainstream women who just don't see themselves in this narrative. And finally, they end up tarnishing the credibility of all feminist research, including the really good, valuable work.
And to back up her point about alienating women, the author points to this 1992 poll. The results show this really interesting paradox. 63% of women said they did not consider themselves feminists, but at the same time, 57% said there was still a need for a strong women's movement. It kind of highlights this gap between the movement's goals and what the feminist label meant to people at the time.
So where does all this leave us? Let's bring it all together and really look at the author's final argument and why she says she wrote this critique in the first place. And this brings us right to the core of her argument, and really to the title of the book. She contends that this gender feminism doesn't actually speak for most women. She basically portrays it as a hostile takeover, where a more radical faction has stolen the movement and steered it down a path that the majority of women never even signed up for.
And here, the author is positioning herself not as an enemy of feminism, but as a concerned insider. She frames her entire book as a critique from a feminist who is genuinely worried about the direction her movement is taking.
So this leaves us with one final and I think really crucial question that goes way beyond just this one book or this one movement. In any social cause, in the fight for a better world, where do you draw the line between powerful, passionate advocacy and just plain accuracy? And maybe more importantly, who gets to draw that line?